And for the next 3 years or 4 years, I was strictly practicing Islam, praying day and night, studying, trying to be the most devout Muslim that I could possibly be. But at the same time, I was also reading the Quran, and read it once, twice, and eventually a third time. And I had very serious questions that I never really got the answers to, including that the Quran is described as, or is believed to be the perfect, unchanged, verbatim word of Allah from before creation, delivered to us today, to be followed and believed in at all times by all mankind. But in the same book, I just find so much ignorance and honestly stupidity about the world we live in, the natural world, about different religions, about Abraham, about Judaism and Christianity, and then so much hate and mistreatment of women, which wasn't really right with me, considering that I always had a very good relationship with women and always had like good views of women, and I grew up in a culture where equality was a great thing and all that, and there were so many questions that I just couldn't properly answer. And when I looked for answers, I found that they are focused on distracting and just explaining away instead of simply answering the questions, including things like how Allah describes how He brings the sun from the east and it goes into a muddy pool at night. That's where the sun goes when it goes down. And then Muhammad describing further that he says to one of his followers, "Do you know where this goes?" At sunset, pointing at the sun. And his follower says, "Allah and his messenger know best." And Muhammad then starts explaining and says, well, it travels until it reaches the setting place, the setting place where it then prostrates under the throne of Allah and asks for permission to rise again in the morning, and Allah gives it permission to rise. So then it goes back to the place of rising and rises again for the next day, until some point in the future, Allah will not give it permission to rise again, and will say to it, "Go back where you came from." And then the sun will come and it will rise from the west, and that's when we know that the day of judgment is about to come. And all my life as a Muslim, I heard that one of the signs of the end will be that the sun will rise from the west. And suddenly I read it and I see how this is actually introduced. And it's so stupid.
How did you reconcile believing it to be stupid while also being a devout Muslim?
That's the problem. I try to suppress those, like my actual thoughts about it. And then that's where the real fight started, because I thought, wait, this doesn't make sense, but I can't say it doesn't make sense. I have to find an answer to it. So I tried to find an answer to it.
I was going to say, I would imagine the next step would be to try to interpret this in a spiritual sense.
Yeah, and there is just no explanation. And I look into interpretations of it, and I see that the interpretations of this Quran verse, the exegesis in the early years of Islam, don't go into such a direction at all. Only later on, as Muslims begin discovering the rest of the world and discovering a more enlightened world, they start reinterpreting these verses to mean something different. While regular traditional Muslim scholars still in the 1500s still think that this is literal and that the earth is actually flat, and only those wicked astronomers and scientists believe in the round earth and so on. And I try to suppress my mind and the questions, but it only works until it just doesn't anymore.
So, but were there different schools in the beginning of Islam that you could have turned to for a different interpretation and then just written off the more strict interpretations as too legalistic?
No. There was a school that I found out was seen as a more rationalist school in the early centuries of Islam, that was later on suppressed and basically crushed and made illegal, which was called the Mu'tazila. They were known as rationalist people, and I thought maybe this makes sense, but they weren't actually about being rationalistic about the world. They were just about it was rather a matter of how they interpret free will and predestination, and how they interpret whether the Quran is the created or uncreated word of Allah, and so on. So matters that are kind of besides the point here, and there are no real interpretations. And I find at some point that these reinterpretations of the text start developing, especially over the last centuries. But it's quite obvious that they're just trying to explain, or they're not applying an exegesis, but rather an eisegesis. They're simply trying to find a new meaning to something that is obviously wrong.
Okay. And
it just doesn't really resolve the problem at hand. The Quran is not a book that is meant to be totally metaphorical and all that. It is a book where Allah supposedly says that it is a revelation by Him, word for word, that makes everything clear as day, makes everything very, very clear and easy to understand, and that shows people endless signs about the world. Now, there are some Muslims today, when you bring up these scientific issues in the Quran, they say, "Oh, it's not a book of science." Well, unfortunately, the Quran itself doesn't say that. The Quran itself clearly and actually challenges people and says, look at the sky, how it has no cracks, and how Allah raised it up. In this, there are signs for you. So the Quran itself clearly talks about these things as clear signs and evidence that it is Allah Himself who created everything. So it is a book that tries to be about science, but fails to be about science, or fails to be correct about science. And
Christians like myself, when we bring up some of these discrepancies, are told it's because you don't read the Arabic, and so you're not actually reading the word of Allah. But presumably you were reading it in Arabic.
I wasn't reading it in Arabic, but I was reading it. I started making use of a word for word translation and etymological analysis and all of that, which is what I love to use nowadays.
Okay, but then were you accused of the same thing then? You're not reading it in Arabic, therefore you're not really understanding it?
Well, the funny thing was, I am still sometimes accused of doing that, but once I respond with a resolution to this, which is directly going to the Arabic interpretations of the Quran.
I see.
And also, in today's time, we have the internet, right? It's very easy.
Be sure to download Truthly. Truthly is like ChatGPT, went to OCIA, got baptized, and now is on a mission to evangelize the world. Check it out, truthly.ai.
If you want to look up what a Quran verse actually says, I have my familiarity with Arabic language and etymology and all that by now. But if you want to look up what a Quran verse actually says, you can very easily search for the Quran verse and type something very easy on the internet, Quran corpus, and whatever verse you want, and it will quickly give you the different translations.
Yeah.
In addition to that, the morphology, the breakdown of the verse word by word, how this word is used throughout the Quran, how this word is formed,
right,
part by part, and so on.
I suppose, but I guess it seems to me that more than maybe not knowing the Arabic perfectly, you're going back to authoritative sources who do know the Arabic and who are confirming that this thing that doesn't make sense to you, that's exactly how it's meant to be taken.
For example, the big issue, which when you bring it up to Muslims today, they often will say, no, this is clearly not a problem, this is clearly metaphorical, clearly allegorical. But the Quran says in the, I always forget the number of this, in the 8th chapter, I believe, that the sun goes and travels to its resting place where it then sets in a muddy spring. And who would believe that? Obviously, there must be something metaphorical or allegorical about this. This can't be literal. But the thing is, if you go back to the earliest interpretations of the Quran, written in Arabic, partly nowadays available in translations, the Tafsir of Tabari, which is one of the earliest authentic interpretations of the Quran, what it says is it comments on this verse, and it then lengthily discusses the details of this muddy or dark place that the sun actually sets into. It talks about how, according to one view, it is a hot spring. According to another, it is a dark and murky, muddy spring. According to some, it goes in this way, it goes in that way. Interpretations that this is actually not an actual spring only start coming into existence centuries later, when Muslims start expanding and including populations that are already aware of the shape of the world, pretty much.
All right, let me be a Muslim apologist for a second. I mean, how does this differ from Christianity? You have some church fathers that seem to hold quite clearly that we live on a young earth. They have no concept of evolution. And now all of a sudden you have Christians who maybe wish to believe that the earth is old, that are very much open to evolution. So couldn't you just say the same thing? You're reading Genesis. It might, I'm not saying it does, but someone might say it might seem ridiculous to them. So they go back and they look at some of the earlier sources. How did they interpret it? And they interpret it in a way that I'm not willing to accept today. So what's the difference? Why not just say, actually, you're wrong to think of it in a literalistic way. So were those people who interpreted it. And so just interpret it in a spiritual way now, in a poetic way now.
Well, I want to ask you that question.
Oh, no, don't do that. I'll do that when you're interviewing me. Oh, you can ask me.
So here's the thing. When we talk about the Quran, specifically, this becomes a problem because the Quran itself is viewed as there are no discussions about the purpose and what the purpose of the Quran actually is, what the purpose of certain texts within the Quran are. Like when you read the book of Genesis, for example, you have a text that there's lots of aspects of it that might be difficult to deal with, such as the age of individuals that lived according to the text, how they lived to become like hundreds of years old. And I don't know, you can talk about Noah's Ark and how it's actually plausible for it to happen in reality. You can talk about about Jonah and how it all came forth. And there are lots of different views.
I was also going to say, in addition to that, there's also clearly different genres in the Bible.
Yeah.
So you do have poetry, you do have different things.
When it comes to the first 5 books, the Torah, the Pentateuch, there are traditional Jewish viewpoints on that. There are traditional Christian viewpoints on it. There are newer Christian viewpoints on it, and so on. And there are lots of discussions on to what extent these texts are supposed to tell a true story or a literal story. To what extent they are supposed to be simply educational and all that. With the Quran, there is not really much room for this because the Quran itself. It starts out with saying that this is a book about which there is no doubt. It later on says that if there's only one discrepancy in this book, then it is clearly not from Allah.
Wow.
It says that this is a book full of signs about the world. Look at it, and so on. So it makes these things like, instead of, for example, talking about a time where the stars fall or something like that, which is, for example, a narrative that you might find in the Bible. In the Bible, this is not used as an instance of saying, look, this is clear proof that this was created by Allah. In the Quran, you do find that. In the Quran, you do find these narratives as pointing at Allah's creation. Look at it, this is proof that this is from Allah. But it clearly is not. So there is a difference of genres. And it's very plausible to me that that Muhammad may have picked up lots of these wordings and these narratives from the Jews and the Christians that he interacted with, but he clearly didn't. He clearly couldn't make sense of the things that he was picking up, and he simply regurgitated and recited these things in his own new revelations as if they were clear revelations from Allah, supposed to prove that it is Allah who is behind everything and Islam is the truth and all that. So there are lots of different ways of dealing with this in the biblical sense, not so much in the Quranic sense.
Okay.
Thanks very much for watching that clip. You can click the link below if you want to watch the full interview, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.